Chapter 6 of Glass Houses. She indulged in a cab. The rain was washing against everything. The world was sodden and dreary out, the way it was sometimes at that dusky hour when she was tired. She hesitated a moment before stepping out on the sidewalk. The question was whether to rush to her door, taking a chance on slipping, or to walk sedately and risk her shoes filling in the inch-deep water. The water was deceptive, sliding in sheets the way it did over the cement. It didn't look as deep as it acted when you stepped in it. She decided to risk her shoes. She couldn't stand the idea of falling down right now. Haste makes waste, she told herself, and stepped sedately onto the walk. There were several sharp spatters of water near her and a funny popping noise in the background. A truck honked at somebody. The front of the building shone whitely with lights, and the sidewalk shimmered with a reflected glare. The rain poured into the gutters. She could hardly wait to get inside, but forced herself to move slowly and smoothly. She wasn't really terribly surprised when she went sprawling. It had been that kind of day. She procrastinated about getting back up, lying still for a moment. Her eyes pointed at something dark and shadowy, which identified itself presently as a fire plug. A hand lay inert beside her face. She moved her fingers to make sure it was hers, and it was. She was numb all over, and she knew she'd hurt when she let herself. However, she was aware that she was not injured badly, and it was a feminine indulgence, a weary acceptance of her fate, and not a genuine weakness, that prompted her to lay her cheek down on the wet sidewalk. She wouldn't have done it if she hadn't known she could get into a warm bath in a few minutes. She could feel the cold water drawing up her hair like a wick and spreading over her scalp. The water was coming up between her legs, too. Some small whirring thing snapped sharply past her head, spatting droplets of water into her eyes like cold little darts. After a moment, another thudded into the side of the fire plug. It hit with a rapid, firm thunk like a typewriter key. Too fast to see, but she saw the water spat away, and she saw something arch up and over and drop an inch from her nose. She realized that although she couldn't move her arm, the tiny object was within the range of her fingers, so she slid them over the slick cement and picked it up. A bullet? Her fingers were so numb she could hardly feel the hard little object between them, and her eyes were fuzzed with rain and excitement. Could it be? Her senses were no help to her. Her ear, which was pressing the icy water away from the sidewalk, was roaring with cold and abuse, and she was unable to tell whether the urgent noise was inside her or outside. She could hardly think. What a time for her powers of observation to leave her. What a time to be struck with paralysis. She pulled herself clumsily upright on her feet, and the commotion of the moment faded a little. She was still excited, but she was alone in the dark rain, and all the vague shouting seemed to be in her head. She looked again at the object in her hand. A bullet? Maybe, but if it was a bullet, that meant somebody was shooting at her. She moved uneasily towards the door of her apartment, but something spattered across the sidewalk in front of her. A bullet! She turned away from the building and the light and hurried away from the little spits down the dark sidewalk. Towards what? She didn't know. Her cab was long gone, She hurried away. It was nearly all apartments on this block, but none of them were fancy enough to have doormen. You had to ring somebody's room and wait for the answering buzz that would unlock the front door. If she stood still, though, in some doorway, she would make an easy target. Nobody was on the street. The rain was pouring down against everything. There were no cars even. She didn't run flat out, but kind of trotted so as not to lose all her dignity. She was too self-conscious to allow herself the excess she felt. It seemed absurd to think that somebody might really be shooting at her. If she had tried to imagine herself in this situation, she would have assumed that there would be tears and hysteria. In the back of her mind, the word death summoned with it a chorus of screamings and wailings, a tangle of arms flailing in protest. She didn't want to die. In the back of her mind, there was a plaintive cry, "I don't want to die," but she didn't scream. She probably would have looked very ordinary to anybody watching, a pretty girl in a hurry. Only a few yards down the block she saw somebody sitting in a car. His back was to her, so he hadn't noticed her predicament. She hurried to the car door and crouched beside it, knocking on the window. The shadowy face inside was half lit by a street light. She saw two heavy black eyebrows, two coal black eyes burning out at her. He rolled the window halfway down so she could talk to him. "Excuse me," she said. I'm sorry to bother you, but I have a problem." His eyes would have been unsettling in any face, but sunk as they were in bony hollows, contrasting as they did with his fine white skin, they were irresistible. It was impossible to meet them, and impossible to look anywhere else. They made her skin feel hot as they brushed the various places of her face. She hesitated. She was afraid of him. But she heard a sharp spatter near her, and she was more afraid of that. I think somebody's shooting at me." "Shooting, did you say? Somebody's shooting at you?" She nodded. "Get in," he said sharply. The door was instantly open. She had time to think that he understood a lot about how people move. He was able to pull her into the car with him quickly, efficiently, without hurting her. One of his hands had closed high on her arm, and the other pulled her knees around right. There was none of the clumsiness usually involved in getting in and out of cars in a hurry. In one motion he pulled the door shut and started the engine. Her head was in his lap, and one hand caressed her back lightly, as if she were a small child and he was trying to comfort her. She felt the car snap forward, wheeling out of the parking place and down the street. "It's okay," he said. "You're going to be okay." His voice didn't sound the least bit excited. She was swung steadily against him as they rounded a corner. She could hear the tires squealing in the far distance, and then he had pulled to a stop again. "Okay," he said, "let's take a look at you. Are you hurt? Here, don't cry, it's all right. Are you hit anywhere?" He pulled her gently upright in the seat close beside him. His arms were lightly around her, his hands running over her arms, moving them experimentally. "Relax for a minute now," he said, letting her head lean back against his shoulder. "Close your eyes. Listen. Think. Can you feel anything? Do you hurt anywhere?" "No," she said. She was breathing in a jagged, hiccuping motion. She could feel the chill of her wet hair against her neck. She understood that this strange man should not have his arms around her, but it was deeply comfortable to be against him, to be comforted and caressed after her fright. Okay, he said, now this is important. Do you know who was shooting at you? No. Do you know why anybody might be shooting at you? No. Good, good. Then he moved her gently away from him, brushing her wet hair away from her face with his hand. She saw that his attention was on the rear view mirror, grim and still, his whole being silently dangerous for a moment, until a car had sloshed harmlessly by through the wet road. I think I might have made a mistake, said Marilyn. His eyes widened, and he nodded gravely, not without humor. A mistake, he said. Well, it happens all the time. It's easy to make mistakes. Was he amused? I think it was all a mistake, said Marilyn. Ah, said the stranger. Oh, probably, probably. What was it that brought you to make the mistake? Do you remember? His eyes were unreadable. They burned into her as if they were seeing right through her into something else. Well, it was raining and I fell down and then there was some splattering, said Marilyn. Some what? Some splattering, you know. She opened her clenched hand. The little object she had picked up was still there. In the dim light of the car she could see it glint, and she could see the dent in her palm where she had pressed it too tightly. Here it is, she said. See, something bounced off a fire plug, and I thought it was a bullet. I think it's a bullet. Ah, he said, and took the little object from her hand. Well, he said finally, I can't tell you what it is, but it's not a bullet. Maybe it's a bullet, she said. I mean, maybe it got all bent up, you know, from hitting the fire plug. This time she was sure he was laughing at her. His eyes were bright, and his tone was gentle and sober, like one uses with a child. It's true that bullets get bashed around, he said, but this definitely isn't a bullet. You can take my word for it. Oh, you're lucky. If a real bullet had ricocheted off a fire plug into your hand, you wouldn't have much hand left. Oh, was that the only thing that made you think somebody was shooting at you? Well, that and the splattering. The splattering. Does anybody have a reason to shoot at you? No. Has anybody ever shot at you before? No. Good. You're a very lucky girl. Yes, said Marilyn, I think it was all a mistake after all. Thank you anyway. It was a pleasure, particularly considering the happy outcome. I guess I'll just go home then, she said. Good idea, he said, and he gently took his hands away from her. Without him touching her, she suddenly felt alone and cold. He started the car again. She saw they were parked in somebody's driveway. Is there a back way into your building? He said. It was hard for her to keep her voice steady. Down here, she said, and they took the alley. They hadn't gone very far in their escape, and it took only a few seconds to reach the rear of Marilyn's apartment. But in that time, her mind began to move very fast. What had possessed her to get into a car with this man? She was afraid of him. There was something very dangerous about him. Despite his gentleness with her, his face was like a hawk's face. His eyes were like bird's eyes, unwincing, piercing, unknowable. He was too easy about the possibility that somebody might have been shooting at her. It was as if he were used to such business. On the other hand, she had been badly frightened, and his sureness was comforting to her. She was awfully glad she didn't have to walk alone up to the front door of her building. She was glad he was taking her this far, but she didn't want to know him after that. His hands on her had been so natural, it was almost as if they knew each other already. When we go in, he said, I want you to stick real close to me. Can you do that? If I start moving fast, you start moving fast. Oh, that's all right, said Marilyn. You don't need to come in with me. I'll let myself in. By the way, he said, people call me Korak. Korak? And you? I'm Marilyn. Marilyn, yes, a lovely name. Marilyn Potter. He had pulled up against a building in a no parking zone. If Mrs. Johnson were to see her associated with anyone parking here, he reached past her and locked her door. I'd like you to get out this side, he said, and stood curved over her as she pulled herself past the steering wheel, hustling her in front of him up the drive into the garage. She realized he was walking so as to shield her with his body from anybody outside the building. It's really, said Marilyn. I mean, you don't need to. Her voice echoed in the garage. He stopped and elaborately turned, taking her by the shoulders and putting his face close to hers. Shh! Chastened, she tried to keep her heels from clicking so loudly. Dripping water sounded musically, but abnormally loud, a cool sound against her hushed breathing, her rustling movement. He seemed to make no sound at all. He moved like a great cat, each part of his body swinging at its own volition, independent of the rest of him. His steps quick and easy, his hips rolling in their sockets. He walked as if he didn't have a care in the world, as if he were full of happiness, but she sensed the ferocity underneath the surface, ready to spring out if anything should threaten him. He was like an animal. They had to wait for the elevator. His eyes moved restlessly around the darkened garage, but there was nothing to worry about. They were alone. You know, she said softly, mindful of his effort to be quiet, the more I think about it, the more I think nobody was shooting at me. It was just in my imagination. He looked at her carefully. Amused again? Didn't you like to play hide and seek when you were a little girl? To tell you the truth, she said, I feel kind of silly. Don't ever be ashamed of protecting yourself, he said. It's never silly to protect yourself. Well, I mean, if you're absolutely sure that that wasn't a bullet. Her voice trailed thinly. I'm absolutely sure that wasn't a bullet. The elevator door opened. I live on the third, she said, though she wasn't at all sure she wanted this strange man to know where she lived. We'll just punch them all, he said. It never hurts to punch them all. However, she noticed that he didn't punch the ground floor. I mean, if you're sure it wasn't a bullet, she said. How many times has this happened? He asked. It's never happened before. Never? In your whole life? No. That's what I thought. It would be easy for me to make a mistake, she said. I don't even know what it would look like or sound like to be shot at. Promise me something, he said. The next time you think somebody might be shooting at you, run. Okay, just run. Feel silly later. You've got to learn to trust your instincts. The elevator had made its excruciatingly slow and painful way up to the second floor and opened its door. He stepped quickly out, looked up and down the hallway, and pulled her after him. This isn't my floor, she said. She was beginning to feel panicky again. I'm on the third floor. Doesn't matter, does it? He said. We can walk up. He hurried her down the hall to the stairway. He seemed to know exactly where it would be. Do you mean you think somebody might have really been shooting at me? Really? She could hear the high edge in her voice and fought to bring it back to normal like his was. He stopped again just outside the door to the stairwell. He knew, she knew, he was listening and watching like an animal for everything that might be moving in the building. He put his hands on her shoulders, and she felt the calmness flow through her. He spoke carefully, seriously. I trust my own instincts, he said. That's why I'm alive. And my instincts tell me that you're a sensible girl underneath all that flutter. You don't trust yourself very much, and you enjoy being pushed around, but you've got a good head on your shoulders, and when you're afraid you're being shot at, I feel like listening to you. Even if even if it wasn't a real bullet you found. Now, when we start into the stairwell, I want you to be real quiet. Just follow me up. We'll chat later. The apartment was dark and empty, and her room was an incredible mess. Is this the way you left it? He asked. I think so. Do you want to call the police? The police! She suddenly realized something she'd been trying not to think about. If anything had really happened, if somebody was really shooting at her, it would not be a police matter. It would have to do with the transcript. She could not confide that problem to the police or to anybody else except Jason. The thought of it being real made her feel weak, but it couldn't be real. She was sure it wasn't real. No police, huh? Said Korak. She saw that her reaction to the thought of police had told him a great deal. She would have to be more careful. She would have to get him out of here as soon as possible and call Jason. He prowled silently through the darkened rooms, insisting on exploring Marcia's and Pat's rooms before he was satisfied they were alone. Then he took a small, black, transistor-looking thing from his pocket and ran it carefully near the walls and furniture before he would let her even enter her room. What's that? She asked. Oh, it's a handy little gadget. I use it in my work. Are you with the CIA or something? She said. No, no. This time he laughed outright. I'm just a small businessman, export-import. I have a couple ratty old helicopters and I ship things in or out of the country. I work on consignment. What were you looking for with that machine? Nothing in particular. I just wanted to make sure this place wasn't booby-trapped, that's all. She didn't even take off her coat. She didn't want to encourage him to stay. She stood wet and uncomfortable in the middle of her floor. I mean, just because I wasn't even sure. I thought somebody might have been shooting at me. It looks to me like somebody's gone through this place pretty thoroughly, he said. I just wanted to make sure they didn't leave anything behind them. That was me, she said. I was looking for something this morning. Oh, what were you looking for? Nothing much. Again, she told him something with her expression. She began to feel very frightened. She wasn't good at hiding her thoughts. What if he became curious and tried to figure out her secrets? Might he be able to trick her somehow into telling him too much? She resolved to be very, very careful. I'm not really the neat type, she said. At that he threw himself down on her easy chair and laughed outright. Not the neat type, he said. How had she gotten herself into this? Her position was suddenly becoming very clear to her. She had lost a top secret document that could conceivably threaten the very existence of the United States, and then she had proceeded to pick up this stranger and bring him to her apartment where he might just come across the papers at any moment, and not just any old stranger, but a man who was clearly accustomed to cloak and dagger work. She stood in the center of the room, shivering, near tears. If she sat down, it would be like an invitation for him to stay. But her knees were weak, and she was going to have to sit down sooner or later. "What kind of work did you say you do?" she said meaningfully. He stood up and approached her. She stepped one step back from him. "Export, import," he said. "Don't be afraid of me. I wouldn't hurt you." His eyes, which had seemed so black and implacable in the car, were really a soft and expressive brown. His generous mouth, far from being the hawk's slit she had thought, was really almost prettily curved. He had a look of quality, of sensitivity, of honesty. She felt herself trusting him in spite of herself. "It's not true that I like to be pushed around," she said. "I don't." "What? You said I like to be pushed around." "I shouldn't have said that. You don't like it at all, do you? But you let yourself be pushed around. You ask to be pushed around." "I can't help it," she said near tears. You came up here." "As a matter of fact, you insist on being pushed around. You don't want to make any more decisions than you can help, do you? You want your decisions to be made for you. You are begging to be pushed around." "I'm not." "It's written all over your forehead in big purple letters. Push me around." "Just because I'm not the aggressive type." "You're certainly not. But that doesn't mean you don't have a hand in what happens to you. You set people up to push you in certain directions, don't you? You want people to push you into things so you don't have to take the responsibility for where you end up." "I need to take a bath," she said. "An excellent idea." "I want to thank you very much for helping me." "Here, you'll need some fresh clothes." He began to rummage through her drawers, pulling out various articles and tossing them on her rumpled bed. I think I can take my bath for myself," she said. "Good. Don't worry about me. I'll just amuse myself out here," he said, the moss necklace in his hands. "It's not that I don't appreciate, but I'm perfectly all right. Now, I've got a phone right here. I've got double locks on the door." "I know. I locked them." "I mean, you really don't need to stay any longer." The tears were flowing down her cheeks now. They were tears of exhaustion, of frustration, of fight. He towered over her. "Look," he said, "there's something wrong here. You're going to make up your mind to tell me about it pretty soon. I'm not going to demand that you talk to me, but I'm not going to try to pry it out of you, but you're going to see that you need my help, and when that time comes, I'm going to be sitting right there, see?" Waiting until her eyes had followed his finger. "In that chair. You don't have anybody else you can trust, do you? You know you're a gutty kid underneath all that flutter. Go ahead and take your bath. Think about it." She felt herself leaning towards him. She had the most terrible urge, almost an irresistible urge, to tell him everything about Jason and Peace and Buzz and the transcript. It was her own impulse to trust him that was frightening her now. She pulled herself back. "You see, there's absolutely no reason in the world anybody would want to shoot me," she said. "Maybe somebody found whatever it was you lost. Maybe you know something somebody doesn't want you talking about. Maybe somebody is afraid you'll figure something out if you have time to think about it. I think you know a reason why somebody might want to shoot you." "No reason. but she was suddenly crying out loud. "I'm sorry," she said. "I think I'm coming down with a cold." It wouldn't be any wonder. She began to sob helplessly, and suddenly his arms were around her, the way they had been in the car. She let herself sink against his big shoulder, his strength, his sureness. She was too weak to resist him, but he didn't try to turn the moment into love-making. His touch was controlled and meticulous. She felt a deep gratitude towards him that seemed almost more threatening than her fear of him. She had to hold herself back from the excesses she felt. She pulled herself away from him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm just not used to all this excitement." "It's okay, Potsy," he said. "Take your bath. We'll talk about it later." Potsy! He had called her Potsy! That fact was at first deeply comforting and natural. Only after she had gotten in the tub did it begin to take on sinister overtones. Nobody had called her Potsy for at least 2 years. It was only the people back home in Casper who knew she was really Potsy and not Miss Potter or Marilyn. How did he know to call her Potsy? She felt completely overwhelmed by him. He was an irresistible force. She knew before the evening was over she would be like soft putty, and he could work her any way he wanted, and she felt herself welcoming that. It was such a relief to give herself up to another current. She washed her hair twice, and then soaked in the tub before washing it again. Then she let the steam gather in the room as she lay in the tub. When she was feeling hot and sweaty, she opened the window over the tub and lay back again in the warm water, enjoying the hotness on her skin and the cool air in her lungs. She let her mind drift off into nothing, into the dripping wall, the beads of water on her knee. She didn't want to think about what had happened to her. She had made a stupid, clumsy mistake that threatened to wreck peace, and now everything had gone so complicated. But the thoughts pressed back in on her again and again. To lose her life. Her life. What difference did her life make? Peace was a world issue. A great many people were going to die to make peace work. It was only fair that she be one of them. No, since she had put the program in jeopardy. No, no, please. Of course, that didn't seem to be the trade. She was not being offered death in order to make up for her error. Somebody was just after her, that's all, and there didn't seem to be an explanation to fit it. One by one, she let the events of the evening run through her mind. She thought she had been shot at. On the very same day she had lost the transcript. Could that be a coincidence? Yes, it certainly could. The most likely thing in the world was that she might imagine all kinds of deadly things after a day of grilling by Jason. As this possibility, almost certainty, came again to her mind, she felt an enormous relief. She had found Korak on the same day she had imagined herself being shot at. On the same day she lost the transcript. Could that be a coincidence? And morosely she realized it couldn't, or at least the probability of such a coincidence was so remote it wasn't worth considering. She had never met anybody like Korak in her life. Why not now? Why now? But she had found him. He hadn't found her. Why had he been sitting there in that particular car? Because he was following somebody. Who? Her, of course. As she relaxed, the details came into her mind. He had known the layout of her apartment building. He had been right at home in her apartment and seemed to know where everything was. He had pulled out all the right drawers to get her clothes. He had known her nickname. He couldn't possibly have been the one shooting at her, and he couldn't have anticipated that she would come to him for help. But the reason he was the only one around could have been that he was keeping an eye on her. Why? He wasn't with the CIA. He wasn't with the government at all. He was there because word of the lost transcript was out, and he was one of the people looking for it. And he was in her apartment right now, this very minute, rummaging to his heart's content. But he had already searched her room. That was clear. And if he had been satisfied with what he found, he would not be grilling her now. But what was he grilling her about? He didn't seem to be asking the sort of questions somebody who knew the contents of the transcript would ask. He was just fishing. He didn't have the least idea what was lost or what was in it. Ideas came fast now. Secret Service agents had been retracing her footsteps all day long, looking for the document. They had covered all the bars she had been in last night, and every conceivable place she might have dropped it. Suppose somebody had gotten wind that something important had been lost, and simply wanted to find out what it was. The shooting might have been a coincidence. She'd been so jumpy. It could easily have been a coincidence, or it might have been done by one of his rivals. Surely not one of his cohorts. If he didn't know what was in the transcript yet, he would not want her dead. She remembered his theory that somebody might not want her to figure something out and was trying to kill her before she did, and he wanted her to tell him what it was before they killed her. She paced up and down the bathroom floor, dripping wet. She caught a glimpse of her body in the mirror, a flash of pink, but she didn't really focus on it. She was thinking clear, sharp words that pounded out of the blackness of her mind. Yes, they were saying, and of course. She was too excited to get dressed, and too excited to stand still. She let the water out of the tub. She was to be in his protection now. In his protection. He said he wanted her to decide on her own, to tell him all her troubles. And what would he do if she didn't? Drug her? She should call Jason right away. She should have called Jason immediately. And why didn't she? The answer was terrifying. Because even then she instinctively knew that any attempt to call for help would force his hand. If he really was some sort of spy, would he allow her to summon Jason? Of course not. She was trapped. She had been trapped from the moment she got in his car with him. She could have screamed for help. He probably would have had a solution for that situation. He was so good at that stuff. She knew she was totally trapped, irrevocably trapped. He would never allow her to get away from him now that he had her. Her skin was pink and taut from so much bathing. The bath powder felt smooth and soft on it. Her hands were a little shriveled, and she creamed them. Her hair was brushed almost dry. The only solution was to escape, of course. She opened the bathroom door a crack and peeked through it, but Korak still sat in her easy chair. He was looping Barney's moss necklace across his hands, examining it. She pulled the door quietly closed again and stepped in the tub to size up the problem of getting out the window above it. She was on the 3rd floor. She wasn't really very far from a fire escape, but it would mean climbing out that tiny window and making her way over to it, at least 5 feet. She thought for a moment of giving up on the idea of escape for now, of simply watching her step and being careful not to give anything away to him. After all, simply knowing something was lost was a long way from figuring out peace. Besides, she might very well be wrong about him. He might very well be a protection to her. But if he drugged her, even fishing for something else, the consequences could become very grim indeed. She owed it to her country to at least make an effort to avoid that possibility. The air was sharp and cold outside. The window sill was icy. The fire escape looked further and further as she tried to imagine herself reaching it across that cold wall. But it was her only chance. He wasn't likely to let her walk out the front door. She took all the towels out from under the sink, wet their corners, and knotted them together. She wasn't sure how she was going to use this rope, but she made it hurriedly, her fingers shaking in her excitement. Surely he was getting impatient with her. Why had she soaked in the tub for so long? If she had gotten this idea earlier, she could have been gone by now, and this time of grace would be given her to make her escape. Now she had to hurry, and she was in danger of being interrupted besides. What if he got suspicious? It made her a little uncomfortable to trust the shower nozzle to hold her weight, but she tied one end of the towel rope to it anyway. It was a good old-fashioned one, and there wasn't anything else handy to hook onto. She made the knot as tight as she could, and then she hung on it for a moment, putting her full weight to it. It held. The knot wasn't likely to slip over the shower head, but would the head stay on? Well, a 3-story fall probably wouldn't kill her. She would land the way she had been taught in gymnastics. Keep that in your head, she said to herself. If you fall, position your body right for the impact. Kick off your shoes. Jesus! It almost physically hurt her to put her wet, dirty clothes back on, but she did it after she had wrapped the clean ones inside out around her middle. It was truly fortunate she had worn her coat into the bathroom and still carried her purse. She tucked the purse in the back of her blouse, out of her way, and put her coat on. It was wet and cold, but it would help protect her as she slid across that dirty wall. She stepped into the tub to look out the window again. The alley below seemed uninhabited. There was Korek's car, so far below. Don't think of that. So hard and dirty down there. What if he was right and there was somebody else waiting for her down there in the darkness? She needed the light out. She'd be lit up like in a frame if she tried to climb out that window with a light on. But what would Korek think if she turned out the light? Would he be able to tell? She had never noticed if you could see a ring of light around the door. She'd never had it closed. The fluffy rug hid the bottom of the door anyway. She turned off the light and waited, but he didn't protest. Climbing out the window was something of a project. She needed to go feet first, but she didn't want to lose her hold on the sill until she knew exactly what she was going to do next. She hadn't really made a firm plan about how to get down. She'd thought that it would be easier to see what she could do once she got herself hanging out the window. She'd had some idea of reaching her feet over to the fire escape and working onto it somehow, but once her feet were out the window, she saw that this plan was so impractical as to be ridiculous. Her legs were not nearly long enough. The air outside was snappy and cold. She was still warmed inside from her shower, but her hands quickly began to get numb, hanging on to the cold, wet towel. Her elbows could feel the cold of the sill through the layers of her damp clothing, and her knees brushed the cold stone of the building. Now that she was there, she saw no way to get down, none at all. What a ludicrous position she was in. She hung indecisively for a miserable minute until a knock, which was polite, but which jarred her as if it had been loud and demanding, forced her into action. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice as sweet and innocent as possible. "Are you just about through?" "Oh, I'm sorry. I was lolling about in the tub, and it felt so good. It felt so relaxing. I hadn't gotten around to washing my hair yet." "Just checking." "I'll tend to business now. I promise." She had to do something. She scooched herself far enough back in the window to reach for the shower faucet, groping for it in the dark. Her bulky coat restricted the stretch of her arm. She couldn't see the glint of the knob. The slick tile was wet and warm under her fingers. By the time she found a knob, she was leaning so far back in she was balanced like a seesaw, ready to tumble in either direction. "Turn it on quickly and get out of here." The knob was sticky, and her leverage was bad. When the knob finally gave, she nearly fell forward into the tub, but an instant later she was knocked back and completely out the window. The assault was so sudden and so violent that she had no time to grab the sill, and it was only through good luck and quick reflexes that she was able to hang on to the towel. As it was, she slid to the very end of her makeshift rope before she got a good enough grip on it to hold her. Her only thought for a moment or two was that somebody had pushed her out the window, and that whoever it was up there in her bathroom waiting to finish the job. However, that was because her mind had been dwelling on being killed. Once she had calmed down, she realized that she had simply not remembered to anticipate where the water would be coming out of the shower nozzle in relation to her head, and the warm gush had struck her on the ear with a roar. "What do you do now, stupid?" But the damage was done. She was in it now, for better or worse. The water on the wet towel had begun to freeze up in thin little flakes. The wall was slick and hard against her. Her feet swung around aimlessly, kicking at the bathroom window below her, but she couldn't have maneuvered herself through it without help, even if she'd been able to get it open. Do something. She wiggled her body a little and managed to make herself swing ever so slightly, like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. Not enough. She put a little more into it. It was frightening. Her knees cracked against the wall. She felt as if she were going to slide off the end of the towel if she swung any harder. Well, you don't have a hell of a lot to lose. She swung harder. Finally, she got a momentum going, but her swings were still ludicrously short of bringing her near anything to hang on to. Finally, a certain boldness began to take her over, like a second wind, a confidence bred of hopelessness, and she found herself swinging very near the fire escape. Two hair-raising swings brought her under the steep slope of the metal stairs, and a third put her in position to grab the stairs with her feet. The contact was bruising. It was only a moment longer before she had released the towel in favor of a step. Hanging under the icy steps like a monkey, she managed to draw herself through one of the spaces so that she was right side up on the steps. On the steps. Right side up! Her triumph was as dizzying as the fear that swept over her now that the real danger was past, bringing her to crouch down on the platform and cling tightly to the railing with both hands, her eyes shut tight against the project ahead of her.